Think about the man your grandfather was. Not the version at holidays. Not the version in the photograph on someone's wall. The real version. The one your parents talked about in careful language when they thought you were not listening. The one whose name carries a particular weight in your family. The one whose patterns, his anger, his silence, his drinking, his absence, his fear, his pride, showed up one generation later in your father. And then you watched your father carry the same thing, maybe in the same form, maybe reshaped into something that looked different on the outside but felt identical in the room. And now you are the parent, and there are moments, specific enough that you can feel them as you sit here, where you catch yourself doing something and you recognize it, not from a book, not from a sermon, from a kitchen, from a car ride, from the atmosphere of a home you grew up in, and something in you goes cold because you swore this would not follow you, and it did. And now there is a child in the next room who is breathing the same air your grandfather exhaled, who is being shaped by a pattern that started before you were born, who cannot see where it came from, who only knows how it feels. What if the struggle you cannot seem to get free of in your parenting is not a personal weakness? What if it is not a lack of faith or discipline or effort? What if it is something older than you? Something that entered your bloodline before you arrived and has been looking for a host in every generation since? And what if Scripture not only named it, specifically, plainly, without softening, but also provided the only mechanism by which it can be stopped? By the end of this video, you will understand what generational sin is in the language of Scripture. Not the vague spiritual concept, but the precise biblical diagnosis. And you will be able to identify which pattern from your grandfather's life is currently running through your home. Because the child in your care is not the origin of this story. They are the current chapter. And what happens in this generation determines whether they become the last chapter or the one that passes it forward. Exodus 25. God is delivering the 10 Commandments. And embedded in the second commandment, the one about not worshiping other gods, is a statement that has unsettled readers for centuries. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. That verse has been debated, softened, recontextualized, and explained away in countless sermons. Because it is uncomfortable. Because it implies that a child can be affected by something they did not choose. But read the verse again without the instinct to resolve the discomfort. What God is describing is not arbitrary punishment cascading down a family tree. He is describing consequence. He is describing the observable, documentable, spiritual, and psychological reality that what a man worships, what he gives himself to, what he structures his life around instead of God, does not stay in him. It travels through his sons, through his grandsons, through the great-grandchildren who carry his blood and never knew his name. The sin God names here is not the occasional failure. It is the pattern, the orientation, the thing a man returns to, the altar he keeps rebuilding. Whatever your grandfather kept returning to, whatever had his primary allegiance, whatever he structured his life around instead of God, that is the thing that traveled. And it is sitting in your home right now wearing a face you recognize. 2 men, same family, 3 generations apart. The grandfather was a man who carried fear, not the fear of God, fear, the kind that masquerades as provision. He worked obsessively because a world that could not be controlled was a world that could destroy him. He was not present, he was productive. His children had everything they needed and a father who was always somewhere else. His son grew up and swore he would be different, and he was. He was there. He showed up to the games and the recitals and the dinners. But the fear was still running. It had changed its costume. It was no longer workaholism. It was control. He managed every outcome for his children because an outcome he had not managed was an outcome that could go wrong. His children grew up provided for and supervised and quietly, persistently anxious, never knowing where the anxiety came from, only knowing that it lived in the house. One of those children is now a parent, and the anxiety is there, in the parenting decisions, in the reaction when something is uncertain, in the tightness that enters the room when control is not available. 3 generations, 1 sin, 3 different faces, 1 unbroken line. That is not fate, but it is pattern. And patterns do not interrupt themselves. 5 markers, each one a signal that a generational pattern is currently running through your home, not a comprehensive list. The 5 most common, the 5 most likely to be present in a Christian home without ever being named. The first marker, a particular sin that skips no generation in your family tree. You know what it is. If you have been honest with yourself for any sustained period of time, you have already named it internally. Anger that rises too fast and too hot. Alcohol that reappears in every generation. Infidelity that has visited every marriage on the male side. Depression that the women in your family have always carried as a private burden. Financial destruction that rebuilds itself in every generation regardless of income. Addiction that changes substances but never changes its hold. Proverbs 26:2 says, "Like a fluttering sparrow or a darting swallow, an undeserved curse does not come to rest." The implication is significant. A curse that keeps landing has a landing strip. Something in the family that keeps receiving it. Something unaddressed. Something that has not yet been brought to the altar where it can be broken rather than borrowed forward. The sin that reappears in every generation of your family is not coincidence. It is not bad luck. It is a pattern that has never met the resistance of someone willing to stand in its path and refuse to forward it. The generational consequence. A child who grows up inside a pattern they have no name for cannot choose against it. They can only manage it. And managed patterns are not broken patterns. They are patterns waiting for the next available generation. The reframe. The pattern can only be interrupted by someone who is willing to name it before it names them. And this is where it gets generational. The second marker. Emotional responses in your parenting that feel older than you. There are moments, specific, recognizable moments, where your reaction to your child is disproportionate to what the child actually did, where the volume of the response does not match the size of the situation, where something in you activates that is not about this moment at all. It is about another moment, an older one that happened to you, or to your parent, or to your parent's parent, and never got resolved, never got processed, never got brought before God in a way that allowed the wound to be healed rather than transferred. Ezekiel 18:2 records God addressing a proverb the people of Israel were repeating. The parents eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. God was confronting the belief that children were simply the passive inheritors of their parents' spiritual condition. He was declaring individual accountability. But he was also acknowledging the reality that the people were describing, that what parents consume, spiritually, emotionally, relationally, creates a sensation in the child's body, an edge, a sensitivity, a response pattern that was installed by someone else's experience and is now running in a vessel that never lived through the original event. The disproportionate response you have to your child's behavior is not evidence that you are a bad parent. It is evidence that something old is present, something that arrived before this parenting moment and is using this parenting moment to express itself. That old thing has a name, and the first step to stopping it is refusing to let it speak through you to a child who had nothing to do with its origin. The third marker, a specific wound from your grandfather's home that your parent never healed from and you have never addressed. This one requires honesty that is uncomfortable, because it means looking at your parent, not to assign blame, not to reopen pain for its own sake, but to trace the wound to its source. Because wounds that are not healed in one generation become wounds that are delivered in the next. Your grandfather wounded your parent in a specific way. Your parent, because the wound was never healed, delivered a version of it to you, differently shaped, perhaps, less severe, perhaps, but the same origin. And you, because it was delivered to you and you have not addressed it, are delivering yet another version to your child. Psalm 51:5. David, in the middle of his most raw confession, writes, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." David is not removing personal responsibility. He is acknowledging that what he carries entered his life before his choices did, that the orientation towards sin is older than any single decision, that the pattern he is confessing has a history that precedes his participation in it. Naming the history is not an excuse. It is the beginning of an accurate diagnosis. And an accurate diagnosis is the only thing that leads to genuine healing rather than surface management. The wound your grandfather carried needs to be named in your generation, not to vilify him, not to hold his failures over your parent, but because unnamed wounds are wounds that keep moving. They travel in the dark, in the unaddressed, in the conversations that never happened, and the apologies that were never given, and the healing that was never pursued. Your child is downstream from all of it, and they deserve a parent who stopped the flow. Stay with this, because the fourth and fifth markers are the ones most deeply embedded in Christian homes, because they are both covered in the language of faith. They hide in plain sight, and they are the most likely to be dismissed as spiritual matters rather than named as generational ones. The fourth marker, a family pattern of relating to God that produces religion without relationship. Your grandfather may have been a church-going man, a tithing man, a man who knew the scriptures and held a position in the congregation. And your parent grew up watching a man who was faithful to the institution of faith and unavailable in the intimacy of it, who could quote the promises of God and had no personal history of experiencing them, whose faith was inherited vocabulary rather than lived encounter. And now you are the parent. And the faith in your home is genuine and also slightly hollow in a way you cannot fully name. The practices are present. The presence is uncertain. And your child is growing up in the same atmosphere your grandfather created, surrounded by the language of God, uncertain of the nearness of Him. Jeremiah 2:13 records God's diagnosis of His people with devastating clarity. My people have committed 2 sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. Your grandfather may have built a cistern, a religious structure that looked like the real thing and could not hold what the real thing provides. And that cistern was handed down, each generation maintaining it, patching its cracks, performing its rituals, but never breaking it open and returning to the spring. Your child deserves the spring, not the inherited cistern. And the return to the spring begins with you being honest about which one you are currently drinking from. The 5th marker, a vow your grandfather made in pain that is still governing your family. This is the most hidden marker, and in some ways the most powerful. Men in pain make vows. They are not always spoken out loud, but they are made. A grandfather who was humiliated swore he would never be vulnerable again, and every man in the family after him inherited a closed-off quality they could not fully explain. A grandfather who was poor swore his family would never lack again, and every generation after him has lived inside a relationship with money that is driven by an old fear rather than a present faith. A grandfather who was betrayed swore he would never fully trust anyone again, and the family has been relationally guarded for 3 generations in a way that made intimacy inside the home almost impossible to sustain. Numbers 14:18 returns to the language of Exodus. God keeps His covenant of love to 1,000 generations. But He does not leave unaddressed sin to disappear on its own. Unaddressed vows, unbroken patterns, unsurrendered wounds, they do not dissolve with time. They compound with time, until someone decides that the compounding stops here. There is a man in Scripture whose unaddressed wound became a generational pattern that sent shockwaves across centuries. His name is Abraham. He was afraid. Twice, in 2 different countries. He told the ruling authorities that his wife Sarah was his sister, not to protect her, to protect himself. And it worked. Both times. Temporarily. He was spared. She was taken. And God had to intervene both times to restore what Abraham's fear had endangered. But here is what most people do not know. Abraham's son, Isaac, the son of promise, the child of covenant, did the exact same thing. Genesis 26. Isaac is in Gerar. He is afraid. And he tells the people there that his wife Rebekah is his sister. The same lie. The same mechanism, the same fear dressed in the same solution. He learned it from his father. He had watched the pattern work, and in the moment his own fear arrived, he reached for the only tool the previous generation had handed him. The wound Abraham never addressed became the weapon Isaac used, without choosing it, without naming it, simply by having lived inside a man whose fear was never surrendered to the God who was more than sufficient to address it. This is still happening. In bloodlines that have carried the same wound for 3 and 4 generations, in Christian families where the pattern is recognized and never interrupted, where the vow made in pain is still governing decisions in a home whose occupants have never heard the vow spoken out loud. You are not Abraham, but you are downstream from someone whose unaddressed wound is currently informing the atmosphere your child is growing up in. And the question this video is asking, the question it has always been asking, is whether you are willing to name it. Whether you are willing to do what your grandfather could not do, what your parent did not do, what every generation before you found a reason to defer. Whether you are willing to stand in the gap between what was handed to you and what you hand forward. Nehemiah 9:2. When the people of Israel returned from exile, they stood in their places and confessed their sins and the sins of their ancestors, not to take responsibility for what their ancestors chose, but to acknowledge that the sins of their ancestors had become the atmosphere they were living in. And that confession was the first act of breaking it, the first act of refusing to let the pattern define the next chapter. You do not have to resolve this entirely tonight. You do not have to have a complete understanding of everything your grandfather carried and how it traveled to you and what it is currently doing in your child. You need to do one thing. You need to name it, out loud, before God. The pattern you recognize, the wound you received, the vow that was made in pain and has been governing your family ever since. Name it, not to wallow in it, to expose it. Because patterns that are named before God lose the power that silence and darkness gave them. They do not disappear in an instant, but they lose their inheritance rights. They lose the claim to the next generation. They become yours to address rather than your child's to absorb.